fantastic. I've made it here as a dress. It has got quite big armholes. I really like that for the summer, but it's still high cut, and I've put a little slit in here, and you've got a tiny little button which looks really, really pretty. If you wanted to rate this dress in terms of difficulty from 1 to 5, 5 being the hardest, then I would say that this is about a 3.
Print off your pattern and attach the pieces together. Use the markings on the patterns or the A, B, C, D and E label. Remove excess paper . If you want to make the dress longer, simply place another sheet of A4 underneath it. Extend your fold line by the amount that you need, in my case 10 centimeters. Do a marking on the other side and attach your back E or your front E. Now you want to extend the line from your back D to the lower part of back E, and you will notice that it's actually a tiny little bit wider than the original. Now you can trim the excess paper off and your pattern is ready. You should have your back, your front and the little facing. You need to cut out the front on the fold, the back on the fold. Ignore the rest of the instructions because we are using bias binding for this dress. I've chosen a really super black jersey and I'm using silk organza bias binding. I also use some calico for my interfacing, and that's simply because it's stiffer and works much better. The first thing you have to do is to snip the center back. That is the point on which you will place your facing. Next we're going to prepare the actual facing. You need to place the jersey on top of the calico. Now I'm just doing it this way around to show you what you shouldn't do, and as soon as you start sewing you will feel the fabric pushing away with it and you're getting a really unsightly pleat. You're lucky if you just get one. You get the same when you work with velvet, for example. And a good trick to avoid this is to always have the fabric which is easier to work with, in this case the calico, on the top and the harder fabric on the bottom. So if you have a jersey or you're working with a velour or a velvet, this is a really nifty little trick to know. And you can see that it's really smooth, the stitching, and that the fabric hasn't moved at all as it did at the top. Next we're going to make our rouleau loop. You also need the piping foot for this blouse. You want to basically case in your piping into your bias binding. Actually I'm using curtain cord because that works much better and it's slimmer and smoother. Cut back the seam allowance about 5mm and then get your fabric turner out. The fabric turner has a little hook at the bottom in which the fabric is hooked as you push it through your bias binding. So you hook it in at the top and then you simply push your bias binding over the top, creating the rouleau loop. Cut the rouleau loop to the required size. I would suggest maybe 4 centimeters, a good one, and put it to the side. Next we're going to do the facing. Next mark the center line and the end. We're now going to sew 2mm either side of this line all the way down and coming back up. At the end you want to reduce the stitch size to about 1, so it's very small stitch, so it can come apart. I'm actually going backwards and forwards as well, securing the end in there. And you're coming back up on the other side and you can extend your stitch length again. Now we need to cut through the center of the tunnel that we've just sewn. Make sure not to cut into your stitching all the way to the bottom. You now need to turn the facing to the inside and give it a very good iron, and it should be all flat like this. You're now ready to do your ruler loop. Attach the ruler loop to the left hand side, pin it to the outside of the left hand side piece and secure it into place. Close the shoulder seams using a 1 centimeter seam allowance, secure at either end. You're now ready to do your bias binding. Attach the bias binding to the outside, begin at the side which hasn't got the ruler loop. Now when you do this, you want to push the fabric into the machine towards the needle so you have a little bit of give in there, and you want to stretch your bias binding as much as you can. It will look a little bit puckered, but once it's ironed that will all come out, and make sure that you don't have an armhole which is stretched. You want to ease the fabric in. Leave a little bit standing over the edge, don't cut it off, about 1/2 centimeter will do. Now we need to trim back the seam allowance so that when we turn the bias binding in, you can't see it. Now we want to stitch back the seam allowance. You need to have the seam allowance facing the binding, and you stitch right next to your sewing seam that you've already got, about 1 millimeter of it, and that gives you a really firm line. If you're not sure how to do this and you can't see it very well, then go to the Sewing Basics. I've used this technique on the other dresses as well, you can check there, but Sewing Basics will show you this technique on a white fabric. Then you turn the bias binding back in, this time lining the presser foot up with the outside of the neckline, so that the stitching line you see from the outside is the same throughout. When you come to the end, you need to tuck in your bias binding and obviously turn it down, and it gives you a really nice edge. Now the facing will still try to roll out, and so to avoid this we're going to stitch it down 2 centimeters of the slit all the way around. I'm giving it actually a little tip at the lower end so that it looks nice and professional. Now we need to do the same again with the armhole. We are attaching our bias binding first by pushing the fabric in, holding it in as much as we can, especially around the curves, and stretching the bias binding, and then stitching the seam allowance back. You want to close the side seams next. I would put a few pins into the side seam and then sew the side seam together. Make sure that you pull the fabric as it comes out of the machine to ensure that it's actually stretchy. Now I've pinned in my bias binding that I've turned down, and again from the inside of the fabric with the presser foot lined up to the outside, you're stitching it down. Finally, you need to do the hem. Pin the hem about 2.5 centimeters up and stitch along again, pulling it when it comes out of the machine, and then do another line of stitching next to the line you've already got from the outside, and that gives you that characteristic look. Here you can see the slightly puckered look that you get when the dress is finished, and on the other side you can see what it looks like when it's been ironed. I like to check that my armhole isn't too tight. So what I do is I place it back on the pattern piece and I can check, and actually I've done it right, so I'm pleased. Finally you attach the button. I come from underneath and I go all the way through because I don't want it to rip off, and finally just remember to wrap the thread around your button, do a loop and then thread the thread through that, cut it off, and the dress is done.